In 2015, Theranos was valued at $9 billion. Its founder, Elizabeth Holmes, was on the cover of Fortune, Forbes, and Time. She was called the next Steve Jobs. She wore black turtlenecks. She had a board that included 2 former Secretaries of State, a former Secretary of Defense, 2 former U.S. Senators, and a Navy Admiral. The company's core product, a revolutionary blood testing device called the Edison, could supposedly run hundreds of diagnostic tests from a single drop of blood taken from a finger prick. Faster, cheaper, and less invasive than traditional lab work. The device did not work. It had never worked. Not when Theranos was showing it to investors. Not when it was deployed in Walgreens stores and used on real patients. Not when Holmes was telling the world she had invented something that would save millions of lives. For more than a decade, the entire apparatus of Silicon Valley, the investors, the board, the media, the partners, looked at Theranos and chose to believe. This is a story about what happens when a single lie scales. Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford in 2003 at the age of 19 with a single idea. What if blood testing didn't require a needle? The idea was not original. Researchers had been trying to miniaturize diagnostic testing for years. The problem was physics. Blood tests require a minimum volume of sample to produce accurate results, and a finger prick produces a fraction of what a venous draw provides. The chemistry doesn't work the same way. The machines can't compensate. Holmes either didn't know this or decided it didn't matter. She founded Theranos in 2003 and began raising money. Her pitch was compelling. She was young, driven, and spoke about democratizing healthcare with the conviction of someone who genuinely believed she was changing the world. And she may have believed it at first. The first board members signed on without asking to see clinical data. The first investors wrote checks without independent verification. Holmes had secured 2 things that Silicon Valley valued more than evidence: a narrative and a personality that made people want the narrative to be true. By 2013, she had raised nearly $400 million. The Edison still didn't work. Theranos operated in a way that was specifically designed to prevent scrutiny. The company was organized into isolated teams: engineers, chemists, software developers, who were not allowed to speak to each other. No one had a complete picture of what the technology actually did. Non-disclosure agreements were aggressive and pervasive. Employees who raised concerns were fired. When Theranos demonstrated its technology to investors, it used conventional laboratory equipment, the kind made by Siemens and other manufacturers, rather than its own devices. Results were altered. Numbers were manipulated. The Edison, when it was used at all, produced results that were flagged as unreliable by the internal quality control systems, and those flags were overridden. In 2013, Theranos entered into a partnership with Walgreens. Theranos wellness centers were opened in stores across Arizona. Patients, real people with real health conditions, had their blood drawn and received results. Those results were often wrong. In some cases, patients were told they had conditions they did not have. Others received screening results that were inaccurate. Doctors received data and made medical decisions based on numbers that Theranos knew were unreliable. Holmes continued to appear on stage, in magazines, and on television, describing a technology that was going to transform medicine. The composition of Theranos' board of directors is worth examining in detail. George Shultz, former Secretary of State under Reagan. Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State under Nixon. James Mattis, retired 4-star general, later Secretary of Defense. William Perry, former Secretary of Defense. Sam Nunn, former U.S. Senator. Gary Roughead, retired admiral, former Chief of Naval Operations. These were not people who lacked experience or intelligence. They were among the most accomplished figures in American public life. None of them had a background in medicine, biology, chemistry, or diagnostic technology. Theranos never provided its board with clinical validation data. The board never asked for it. Holmes managed the board and her investors. through a combination of personal charisma, selective disclosure, and the deliberate construction of an aura of legitimacy. The board's prestige made journalists less likely to ask hard questions. It made investors less likely to demand independent verification. It made partners like Walgreens willing to move forward without due diligence. The board was not a governance mechanism. It was a trust machine. In 2015, a Wall Street Journal reporter named John Carreyrou received a tip from a source inside Theranos. Carreyrou had covered healthcare fraud before. He began making calls. Former employees, most of them still bound by non-disclosure agreements, began to talk. The picture that emerged was not of a company with technology that hadn't worked yet. It was a company that had known for years its technology didn't work and had covered it up. Theranos' response was aggressive. Holmes personally called the journal's editor. The company's lawyers threatened legal action. Employees were warned. The company hired private investigators to surveil sources. Carreyrou's story ran in October 2015. A prized startup's claims strained credulity. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services launched an investigation. The SEC began reviewing the company. The DOJ opened a criminal inquiry. In 2018, Elizabeth Holmes and former President Ramesh Balwani were indicted on federal charges of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit fraud. The $9 billion company was dissolved. The trial of Elizabeth Holmes began in August 2021 and lasted 4 months. Prosecutors argued Holmes had knowingly deceived investors, patients, and partners about the capabilities of Theranos' technology. Former employees testified about falsified results, suppressed quality control failures, and instructions to use competitor equipment while telling investors the company's own technology was being used. Holmes testified in her own defense, unusual in a federal fraud trial. She argued she had genuinely believed in the technology. She said she had been misled by her own scientists. She introduced claims of psychological abuse by Balwani during their relationship. In January 2022, the jury convicted Holmes on 4 counts: 1 count of conspiracy to defraud investors, and 3 counts of wire fraud against investors. She was acquitted on charges related to defrauding patients. In November 2022, Holmes was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. She reported to a minimum security facility in Texas in May 2023. Ramesh Balwani was convicted on all 12 counts against him and sentenced to nearly 13 years. Theranos lasted for 12 years. The question worth asking is not why Holmes committed fraud. The question is why no one stopped her sooner. The answer involves a set of incentives that are, in some ways, specific to Silicon Valley. The culture of venture capital rewards bold claims. Investors who fund 100-to-1 long shots expect founders to project certainty, because the ones who actually succeed often do project certainty before they have proof. The line between visionary and fraud is sometimes only visible in retrospect. Theranos' secrecy, which should have been a red flag, was reframed as a competitive necessity. Protecting IP, not tipping off competitors. This is a legitimate practice in technology. It became cover for deception. The board's prestige created the appearance of rigor. If people with those credentials believed in it, who was a journalist or investor to question it? And the story was too good. A young woman, a Stanford dropout, reinventing healthcare from a single drop of blood. The media wanted it to be true. Investors wanted it to be true. Walgreens wanted it to be true. When everyone wants something to be true, the system that should catch lies often stops looking for them. Elizabeth Holmes is serving 11 years in federal prison. The company she built, once valued at $9 billion, is gone. Patients who received inaccurate test results may never know what decisions were made or what was missed. The Theranos story produced regulatory changes. The FDA and CMS strengthened oversight of laboratory-developed tests. Congressional hearings were held, but the conditions that made Theranos possible have not changed. In the years since Holmes' conviction, New companies have raised billions of dollars on demonstrations that have not been independently verified, in fields where the core technology is years from working at scale. The pattern: compelling founder, prestigious backers, secrecy reframed as strategy, narrative stronger than evidence, repeats. The lesson of Theranos is not that Elizabeth Holmes was uniquely evil. The lesson is that when a system decides to believe something, it will find ways to keep believing it, right up until the moment it can't. The blood was never there, but the money was real.